Landings. Let's talk about how a general landing works before showing you how it's done in the next lesson. If you're already familiar with how to land an aircraft, then skip this video and go to the next one. So for now, without going into any details about numbers and such, let's briefly talk about how a landing works. First, we need to transition from a straight and level flight down to a landing attitude and descend down to the airport. The way we will do this is by reducing our throttles down to a lower RPM. This will naturally lower our nose and we will begin to have a descent rate with a negative VSI value. Now, based on the previous lesson, we know that we will control our airspeed with pitch. If we are going too fast, we will pitch the aircraft up to slow the plane down and pitch forward to speed it up. And don't forget that you do have speed brakes if you need them. The other major part is the descent rate. We will control this with our throttles. In order to increase our descent rate, we would naturally decrease our throttles. This will drop our VSI down further and our flight path will sink. Inversely, if we throttle up, we will arrest our descent rate and our flight path, the aiming point, will raise. Our job is to aim the aircraft at the beginning of the runway and maintain a nice constant speed all the way down. So then the next question is, how do we know if we are descending at the correct rate or angle? Well, this is where the PAPI lights come in. PAPI lights, or the Precision Approach Path Indicators, are a series of 4 lights which help us guide the plane down to the runway safely at a commonly standard 3-degree glide slope. Now, the way these lights work is actually extremely simple. The lights will be a mix of either white or red to indicate if you are on, above, or below the glide slope for the runway. The perfect glide slope of 3 degrees is represented by 2 white and 2 red lights. The more red lights you see, the lower you are below the glide slope, and you need to throttle up to arrest your descent rate. Failure to do so may result in you crashing into an obstacle on your way down. Thus, if you see 4 red lights, you are in very big trouble as you are now very far below the glide slope and in potential danger. The more white lights you see, the higher you are above the glide slope, and you need to throttle back to get back on the glide slope. It's not as big of a deal if you have 4 white lights, since if your approach is really bad, say too high in this instance, you can always just throttle up and go around for another try. A word of advice regarding getting better at using PAPI lights. Let's say that you are at 4 white lights, thus very much above the glide slope. You throttle down a bit, and then you wait and wait and wait for the plane to drop more and more until you see the lights change to 3 white and 1 red, indicating that you are now just slightly high. The incorrect action here that many young pilots do is to do nothing and let the aircraft continue to drop until they finally see 2 white and 2 red lights, indicating that they are now on glide slope. Then they finally react and throttle up a bit to catch the glide slope. Well, if you do this, you will notice that you will fall below the glide slope, and suddenly you are now at 3 red and 1 white lights. This is because it takes a little bit of time for the aircraft to adjust to your new power settings. Now you're going to find yourself dancing up and down to find the glide slope, which, is frustrating. So let's go back to the beginning of this scenario. 4 white lights. Throttle back a bit and wait to see what happens, while keeping an eye on your speed. Now you see that the lights have changed to 3 white and 1 red, indicating that you are now just ever so slightly above the glide slope. At this stage, you should throttle up a little bit, and by the time the aircraft stabilizes or settles, the lights will change to 2 white and 2 red, indicating that you are now at a perfect glide slope. This demonstrates you staying ahead of your aircraft instead of reacting too late to what has already happened. It's a very good skill to start working on now to make your workflow easier later. Another tip. Let's say that you fall below the glide slope to 3 red and 1 white. Do not panic and start pitching up the plane to try and catch the glide slope. Remember, in this configuration, your pitch controls your speed. If you pitch up, you will lose speed and not gain much altitude without any throttle input at the same time. Instead, keep your pitch the same and just increase your throttle to arrest your descent rate and let your plane get back to the glide slope on its own. What you also do not want to do is to suddenly transition from a descent to a climb to try and catch the glide slope above you. This is something new people do in panic after seeing 4 red PAPI lights. You will completely be all over the place by doing so. So the best thing to do would be to apply enough power to fly pretty much nearly level flight until you start to catch the glide slope again, and then you will start your descent again. Never climb up to the glide slope. If you feel that you are too low and that you have an unstable approach and nothing is working, abandon the landing by first applying full thrust, setting flaps to half if they were in full down position, raising the gear, and then gently starting to pitch up to climb as you retract the last bit of your flaps. Trying to clean up your flaps from full flaps to no flaps immediately will result in a sudden loss of lift, causing a very big problem for you. Meanwhile, trying to pitch up first before throttling up will make your plane act like an air brake and potentially stall your plane out into the ground. So always apply thrust first, then pitch up. The landing phase is among one of the most dangerous phases of flight, as you are low and slow, and the margin of error is extremely tiny. As my instructor once said, you can make a lot of small errors, but you can't make a single mistake. Well, thankfully we're in a sim, so we can make those without impunity. Alrighty, so we got the descent down, but we're not yet on the ground. So the next phase is when we are very close to the runway. At this stage, we abandon the PAPI lights as they are not needed anymore. We will instead now aim for either the beginning of the runway or the numbers on the runway, whichever you prefer at this stage. At the appropriate time, we will begin our round out. The round out is simply just a gentle pitch back while we put our throttles to idle. This will arrest our descent rate and prepare us for landing. You should also switch your view to looking down the runway a bit. It helps with the height perception. If the round out is done correctly, then we should be above the runway at a decent altitude and speed. The pitch back and throttle back will make it so that we are now above the runway with the nose almost aligned with the horizon, holding the nose of the plane up from dropping. The aircraft will lose speed and want to drop down to the ground as it slows down on its own. We are basically letting the plane drop to the runway as it loses energy and can't stay in the air anymore, but we're doing this in a controlled manner. Now our job will be to flare the plane for a gentle touchdown, so our back main landing gears touch down first, and then our nose gear will gently touch down after. Now this is easier said than done, but I will show you everything in practice. Okay, so very quickly, one more time now with some numbers to help you. We are flying straight and level. We will begin our descent to the runway in a bit that we have already aligned for. Once you are below 400 kph, you should drop your gear and drop the first notch of flaps to half. Remember, the aircraft will have a tendency to nose up when you drop the flaps and slow down at the same time, so take that into account. We throttle back to drop altitude, and we pitch for speed to aim around the 300 kilometers per hour speed for most of our journey down to the runway. Now, focus on maintaining the glide slope with your throttles using the PAPI lights and the speed at 300 kph with pitch. When you start to get really close to the runway, you can drop your flaps to full flaps, which will further balloon your nose up and slow you down a bit more, so remember to take that into account. You should also remember to trim your plane constantly. It will make this a lot easier for you as you're going down. By the time that you get really close to the runway, you should now be roughly around 270-280 kph. And now you will abandon following the PAPI lights and transition to a visual landing while aiming for the beginning of the runway or the numbers on the runway. At the appropriate time, start the round out by cutting the throttles to idle and slowly pitch the plane back to arrest the descent rate. Keep the nose up, roughly with the horizon, to bleed off the energy and speed, and let the plane slowly descend to the runway on its own, remembering to flare at the end for a gentle landing on the main gears first, and then gently on the nose gear last. Brake and come to a stop while maintaining the center line of the runway. Congratulations, you're a man now.